Let's talk about Yesteryear by Carol Claire Burke. This book is everywhere, everybody's talking about it, and I recently finished listening to it on audiobook, and it was a 5 stars for me. But Yesteryear follows our main protagonist, Natalie, who is a trad wife influencer. She has basically curated a perfect life on social media. Natalie is living this perfect life up until she decides to go to sleep one night, and when she wakes up the next morning, she realizes that she is actually in the 1800s living out this life and the values that she is promoting on her social media account. That Carol Claire Burke's relationship with tradwives doesn't just start with this novel that she wrote. She has been writing essays on tradwife culture for some time, and she was also featured on some YouTube accounts talking about tradwife influencers such as Ballerina Farm, who definitely has a very strong influence in this actual story. I can't help but make a lot of comparisons. I personally believe that this book isn't just a piece of psychological contemporary fiction, but a psychological contemporary fiction story that could also borderline horror in many ways. We're basically in our main protagonist's head the entire time we read this book, and Natalie is a narcissistic, unreliable, and unlikable main character to deal with. You have Natalie, who, like I said, is a very, very unlikable character, unlikable from the start, but you also have a character who you could tell was definitely failed by the people that were around her. I think this book also really highlights the actual toxicity of tradwife culture and tradwife influencing, and how it's actually not feeding into something empowering, but feeding into something else completely different. I also think what this book does really well is highlight how toxic traditional and conservative values can actually harm people, and not just women, on both a macro and a micro level. You definitely see that with not just Natalie, but her husband, their kids, and everybody else that's kind of impacted by this culture. Natalie is a character who doesn't break away from her pattern. She just winds up using it as a way to exploit people and abuse people, which I also really appreciate the author doing, because it makes it very hard to be empathetic with her. However, there were certain moments, especially when Natalie talks about things like motherhood and pregnancy, where I can't help but feel a little bit of empathy towards her in the situations that she was in. You could clearly see that this was a woman who has another identity for herself that she would have loved to fulfill in her life, but due to the product of her own upbringing, she winds up in these chains that basically is her own living nightmare, and that in turn feeds into her own evil, which she then puts out onto everybody else. Books like this really erase sort of like the pretty aesthetic imagery that these tradwife influencers really try to promote on their own platforms. It kind of peels everything back to show a very dark and seedy underbelly that exists under these aesthetics, which I think is definitely a good thing to look at. So many things that I could talk about when discussing this book, so many different themes that I could tackle. The theme of motherhood, of pregnancy, of family dynamics, of power dynamics. Like, there's so many things that this book offers you in its storytelling that I think is really interesting to have a discussion on. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you read Yesteryear, did it live up to the hype for you? Did it not? I would just like to know what you guys think.